Hello again from the Harris Library Studio. Today, you're getting as my background the maintenance bay and kind of uh, amusement area of the Millennium Falcon. Disney has put out virtual backgrounds, and I'm having fun. Um, Perhaps I should be coming to you from a backdrop of either Yalta or Potsdam, but I didn't try to find those for today. Because today, what we're going to be looking at is the aftermath of the Second World War, post war Europe. Now, we're going to be looking at the immediate aftermath and some of the things that happened there, but we're also going to be looking at the growth of the European Union as well. Now, one of the things to note before I move on from this map is actually showing you the division of post war Europe. Over here in red, you will have the communist nations under the influence of the Soviet government out of Moscow. All of these countries will be independent, at least eventually. East Germany will take a little longer, but they'll be independent with their own governments. But those governments are very much being influenced by the decisions in Moscow. In fact, one of those decisions is sometimes to roll the tanks out of Moscow into other places. Now, Yugoslavia over here is also communist, but beginning in the late 50s, it's actually going to break away from from Moscow and is going to follow its own kind of jurisdiction. Austria is going to be Western, but is going to do its best to be very neutral because of its very close border with Hungary and with Czechoslovakia and as Iron Curtain countries. Those you see in blue will be the Western countries, and eventually those countries will be part of the European Union, which we will talk about some today. Now, in my earlier lecture, we talked about the whole business of the conference system that they're going to do during the Second World War, that Roosevelt and Churchill will send over 1,700 messages to one another during the course of the war. And they will meet in 41 before even the United States is in the war properly. The reality is that they met a lot to determine what the post-war world would look like. And two of those conferences, more than any others, are going to determine kind of what the post-war world looks like. Yalta and Potsdam. And those are the two we want to look at today because they have such long-term impact on the world. The Yalta Conference takes place in February 45. The Allies have just won the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of Iwo Jima in the Pacific is still ongoing. We have no idea how long either the war in Europe or the war in the Pacific is going to take. The Yalta Conference is going to take place here on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. It's actually kind of on the back side, kind of the lower side of it. It was a seaside resort. It was actually a really good place. FDR by this point is not particularly well. He's had several bouts with lots of different things over the years. And there's sometimes people are going to say he was too sick at Yalta and he gave away too much. The reality was there were a lot of things that were already in place by February 45. The Soviets had actually already advanced through most of Eastern Europe and were in the process of advancing on Berlin. It's going to be a race to see who gets there first. We will cross the Rhine in March and be racing to get across the Elbe to Berlin. Now, the Soviets already are in possession of Poland, most of Czechoslovakia. There you can see Czechoslovakia. They're in the position of Hungary, though not yet Austria, and a good portion of Yugoslavia. So in other words, most of the Central and Eastern European countries are already under Soviet control at this point. And you can really see where, in fact, the Iron Curtain is eventually going to be by where they are now. There were disagreements at Yalta between the big three, sometimes more between Stalin and Churchill than Stalin and FDR. Churchill wanted to try the German war criminals after the war, and initially Stalin wants a trial, but Stalin wants a show trial. And And FDR is hesitant because he doesn't want them to give them a world stage in which to spew propaganda. And so there's a lot of discussion about this. There are also other disagreements that they have, most notably where they want the borders to be. This is Churchill's plan of partition. He wants a German state here. He wants also a Western German state that will create a border between France and Germany. And he wants another state here. Now you can see Czechoslovakia here, but he wants another one here that would be basically an enlargement of Austria and putting Austria and Hungary back together in one state, kind of as a buffer. It harkens a lot back to where the map was when he was younger. Churchill also wants spheres of influence around the globe, which FDR is not in favor of. Churchill would love to have that, but he's also in favor of fostering problems between these two, the other two allies. Roosevelt's plan of partition was to break it up into Hanover, Prussia, Hesse, Saxon, and there would be Austria, and this is more Bavaria. So and having international areas right through here. So there were lots of different ideas about how to partition Germany and whether or not to break it back out into separate states. And discussions of how to treat the German officials also were part of that. Eventually, they do agree that they need to put some of them on trial. And there's a debate about how many need to be on trial and lots of discussion of that. What do they agree to finally at Yalta after lots of wrangling? The first is the Soviets are to enter the Pacific War. Now, remember, this is February 45. Atomic bombs have not even been are not even a viable weapon yet until July. And so the reality is we think we're still going to have to invade the home highlands of Japan, and we know it's going to be hard. We want the Soviet manpower. In return for that, the Soviets want parts of Manchuria and the Sakhalin Islands, as you can see here. This upper red here they want, including the city called Vladivostok, which means we own the East. They're also going to want the Sakhalin Islands right here, which they still have, and the Japanese want back. That's why they don't have a treaty. The Soviets actually do enter the war, but they don't enter the war until after we've dropped the first atomic bomb. They do help with some of the liberation of China and North Korea. Okay. They project the UN and make some decisions about that. And they tell the Soviets that no, they can't have 16 boats. They can only have 3. They create the kind of format of that. They make some decisions about Eastern Europe, things that will come back multiple times in Soviet rhetoric during the Cold War. The Soviets were to receive about $20 billion in compensation from East Germany. In other words, they were to take their compensation out of Germany in kind. Some of it in money, but most of it in material. The governments were supposed to be friendly to the Soviets in the Eastern European, but they were also supposed to have free elections. The reality is the governments that were liberated by the Soviets are going to become those behind the Iron Curtain, this red line that you see here, okay? Those areas would become, and all of this swath of territory kind of here in this lighter blue, gray, green is also going to go to the Soviets. What is now Belarus, which simply means White Russia, will go back to Russia, as well as the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The free elections don't happen in Eastern Europe, by the way, until the 1990s. There will be 4 occupation zones outlined for Germany, Austria, and for Berlin. There are 4 zones instead of 3 because at the assistance of Churchill, who maintained that the French needed to be part of this in order to heal old wounds, and out of Churchill's respect for de Gaulle. So kind of give you a look, see here, you can see this is how Germany is going to be divided up. This area here in green will be the British, the orange will be us. We've also got a couple of air bases up here in the north, and then the French will have these bluer areas here. And And then Berlin will be further divided up, the red area here being the Soviet Union. And take note of the fact that Berlin is actually inside the Soviet section, and that's going to have tremendous consequences for the Cold War. They also agreed that there will be a war crimes trial for Germans, and there will also be one for the Japanese as well, though that was going to have received less publicity. They will establish the UN structure, and which will be chartered finally in San Francisco a little bit later in 1945, with their first full meeting in New York City. That's what you see here, in 1946. It will have a Security Council to begin with 5 permanent members, meaning the 4 that will be occupy Germany, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and the 5th member of the Security Council that's a permanent member will be China, who is our ally in the First and Second World Wars. The General Assembly would also be created at this point. When it's initially created, the UN is going to have about 52 members. It's grown to 196 members currently. And there's going to be a lot of discussion after the Communist Revolution in China about who gets China's seat on the Security Council, and that has lots of ramifications later on. Now, the Potsdam Conference is the follow-up conference to Yalta, which occurs in July of 1945 following the surrender of the Germans. And Potsdam is a suburb of Berlin, and they're actually going to meet at the old Hohenzollern Palace, which is actually still being held by the member of the family. One of the princes of the Hohenzollerns invites them there. It's held from July the 7th to August the 2nd of 1945, and there's been some changes in personnel. FDR dies in April, and Henry S. Truman succeeds from being vice president to being president. He doesn't know about, in fact, the atomic bomb until he becomes president. He's once referred to the fact to becoming president is that it felt like the moon and stars had fallen on his shoulders. Watch presidents when they take office. They age quickly. Watch the pictures of President Obama or former President Clinton, and how they aged quickly in the job because it carries a weight. Churchill will start out the conference, but the British will have an election in July of 1945, and Churchill will still keep his seat in the parliament, but his party will lose the election, and there will be his deputy prime minister, Clement Attlee, will take over for the duration of the conference. Truman thought that Berlin looked like some ancient city destroyed by the Romans. There was so much carnage and so much destruction, and then he thought it looked like Carthage after the Romans had marched through. There you see Truman and Churchill and Stalin, and very quickly, the fellow over here who almost looks like Hitler is not Hitler. That's Clement Attlee. You see a lot of splits beginning in what had been called the Grand Alliance between the big 3 at Potsdam. The cracks are already there, and they're beginning to widen. Truman is no nonsense. He shoots from the hip. His language was very, very salty. Someone once asked his wife, Bess, if she could get him to quit saying horse hockey as a curse word. And she said, "You don't understand. It's taken me 30 years to get him to say horse hockey instead of other things." The reality was he didn't mince words. He was not the kind of diplomat. He was not high society like FDR. So he was very different. The Russian foreign minister, Molotov, will comment that I've never been talked to like that before in my life. And Truman says, well, keep your promises and you won't hear it like that again. So he's very rough, but it's also very straightforward. And he has actually kind of a grudging respect for Stalin, which is both good and bad. Germany is to be demilitarized and disarmed, and to be denazified and be democratized. There were four does for Germany after the war. And by and large, they do take hold. Democracy has very strong roots in Germany in the post war period, much stronger than they did prior to the Second World War. Each of the occupiers was to be able to take reparations out of their zones. The Russians certainly do. The French do to a point. The British and the Americans take some, but not nearly what the others do. All of what had been East Prussia, that kind of jutting position over there on the map in the east, is given completely to Poland, and the other portion is given to Russia. And kind of show it to you on your map, and there is a map on canvas for this. This area right here had been the Polish corridor, this yellow. All of that is going to be given to Poland. The Oder River, which turns here, and the Neisse River that's right through here. The Oder-Neisse is going to become the line that is the German and Polish border. And this whole area over here in yellow, as well as Danzig, is going to be given to the Poles. So Germany is not going to have another piece on the other side of Poland again. And this city called Königsberg is going to become Kaliningrad, a Russian port on the Baltic Sea, in a little bit warmer water. And like I said, the Oder-Neisse line is going to be used. The other line that's going to have to be discussed is the Curzon line, which is in the east, about where the border of Poland should be. Now, this is actually where Poland's border used to be. All of this is going to be given to the Soviet Union. It's going to wind up in other places like the Ukraine and Belarus now, but that's where it was eventually. And the Curzon line, drawn up by a British diplomat whose name was Lord Curzon, is going to be the one who draws that line. A lot of what we see in the countries of Europe is what we call reverse Lebensraum. Lebensraum, of course, was Hitler's idea of giving the Germans living space. And one of the ways he claimed that was by talking about how many people in these places actually speak German. Well, there's not going to be any people left in those places that are Germans. They're going to ship them all back to Germany. Very, very quickly, we see a reverse. All of this territory here that's going to be given to Poland, the Polish government will eject the Germans and send them back to Germany. The same thing will happen in Czechoslovakia and other places, that this is not going to be allowed. There are going to be about 10 million refugees on the roads in 1945 and 46 because of some of the policies here. They're also going to decide on terms of unconditional surrender with Japan, and once again, the Soviets were going to be encouraged to come into the war. They'll also decide on the 38th parallel as the dividing space for the Americans to liberate the southern portion of the peninsula of Korea, and the Soviets to liberate the northern portion of the peninsula right to the 38th parallel. And this right here is the beginning of North and South Korea. The peninsula had never been divided until this point. And the divisions that are created here are the 38th parallel is still what divides North and South Korea. They discussed making a council of foreign ministers. That doesn't actually come to anything, but they discussed kind of regular meetings, which once again won't come to as much because of the Cold War. In fact, this will die largely after the London Conference in September of 45. And there you can see some of the new borders. One of the key pieces that comes out of the Yalta and Potsdam Conference is the creation of the Nuremberg trials. Now, why are they in Nuremberg? Well, the Nuremberg was where some of the famous Nazi rallies were, and that's one of the kind of hallmark kind of images. But more than that, the reason that they do this has to do with the fact that this is one of the few courthouses in Germany that's still standing. It's still intact, and so we can use this to hold the trials in. So that's one of the major reasons. Now, there are two ways we use the term Nuremberg trial. There is the, capital the, meaning the one, Nuremberg trial that lasts for a year. And this is going to be a trial of the upper war criminals of Germany, including those members of the general staff that are still alive and haven't committed suicide. And then there's the Nuremberg trials, plural S, that will last for 3 years and will try the lesser SS officers. And Rachel, you had asked me about what happened to them. This is what happens to them. This is a shot of the jury there at the Nuremberg trial. You'll notice there's a lot of headphones on people because there is a great deal of translating that has to be done for all of the various jurors from those as in German. 4 primary charges will be brought against them: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. The conspiracy charge was coming out of American law, which had been used against gangsters and RICO trials. These 4 were debated heavily. They're going to be based in part of Germany's signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact and several others early on. The trial itself will be conducted by judges from Britain, France, and the United States, and the Soviet Union. Robert Jackson, that you see here, is the leading American prosecutor. The German Nazi leaders are allowed to take defense. They do get a lawyer and things of this nature, much to Stalin's chagrin. A lot of them use what we call a tu quoque defense, so if you did it too, or that I was simply following orders. But those don't actually work. They're like, no, you should have known that there's a point at which your humanity should have kicked in, and you should say that committing genocide was wrong. Okay, and that just following orders does not catch it for that. But particularly for those who were in high command. The most difficult charge was conspiracy, and that's one they can't really make stick. It doesn't quite work. You'll also see there's a lot of challenges in procedure because the British and the Americans and the French, not alone, those 3 whose systems are closer, still have lots of differences. And then there's the Soviets, where the justice was largely just show trials. The Soviets actually commit some atrocities in Katyn Forest. They try to blame them on the Germans, and the French, the Brits, and the Americans won't have that one. So what do they result with? What happens? Well, there are going to be 24 put on trial here. 12 of them will be sentenced to death. Some will be acquitted, and others will actually serve time in prison. There at the end, you'll see Hermann Goering, the leader of the Luftwaffe. Goering will just say, well, you're just doing this because you have won, and that's why this is justice. This has nothing to do with justice. It's all revenge. But Sir David Marshall Fife is going to be the British prosecutor who takes on Goering on the stand. And Fife proceeds to slice and dice through Goering's rhetoric and his bullying. Goering could be very charming, and Fife was having none of it. And he very much plays a convincing hand to, in fact, a jury. But I did mention that Goering could be charming, and he is going to charm one of the guards there, into letting him have some food, and in that food is going to be some cyanide capsules. So Goering will actually cheat the hangman's noose by in fact committing suicide. There are some precedents here for an international law. There was no international court of justice at this point. There was no sort of international law at all. This is the beginning of it. Now, as I mentioned, there are other trials. Between December of 46 and April of 49, there are going to be trials of the guards at the death camps. There will be medical trials of doctors who performed experimentations on the Jews. There's a good book on this called The Doctors from Hell, which is written by a young woman who was actually the court reporter there at the trials. There will also be Japanese war crimes trials that will put on trial, particularly Tokyo Rose, for her taunting of the American troops. But there also are other parts to ours. Now, the war crimes trial belongs in some ways to the end of the war and the wrapping up of things. But there also is this sense of, well, what comes next? And one of the things that has to come next is rebuilding, because there's a lot of stuff to rebuild. And recovering and rebuilding is going to require a long time in some places. There's going to be tremendous food shortages, down to 500 calories a day in some places. Um, the winter of 1946 is one of the worst winters they'd seen in decades. It was called the winter of a century in Europe. They just hadn't seen anything like this in a long time. Snow drifts, blizzard upon blizzard, and it lasts for a long time. That causes some problems with a lot of people wanting to experiment with communism, what we call stomach communism. I'm hungry, let's try something new, uh, which is going to spur on the communists who are trying to take over in some of these countries, which they were in France and in other places like Greece. But it's also going to spur others to provide help. There was a lot of political disarray in France and in Italy. Italy is going to have a very close vote to establish a republic. It's like 51 to 49% for a republic versus a monarchy. The British will have their first election in July 45. That's their first full general election since 1931. The French will establish the Fourth French Republic, which will last until the 1960s, and they are now still on the Fifth French Republic. Lots of radical parties, and all of them tended to give way to the influence of Charles de Gaulle, who you see here. He had a very large nose, and that's why they loved him with the comics. Lots of places are going to establish social welfare programs. We might call them welfare states. You might call them mixed capitalist and socialist states that are going to be established in Europe during this period. Britain will actually continue rationing until 1954. A lot of it depends on where you are, what kinds of policies they pursue to try and deal with the economic problems of the post-war period. West Germany does not ration. West Germany, once they become a full entity in 1949, is going to completely lift all the rationings, and we're going to call it the Wirtschaftswunder, the West German miracle, where the free markets are allowed to operate, and very quickly Germany comes back online. We'll also see a lot of decolonization affect Europe. Most of the European empires are going to be gone by the mid-60s. The first one that goes in 1947 is India. Israel follows very quickly. There will be some areas where the British and the French both will achieve some level of peaceful retreat. But there's also more often some sort of violence involved. Sometimes with colonists not wanting the Europeans to leave, sometimes a civil war between various groups like in Algeria. It's a complicated and varied tale, and it depends entirely upon what country you're talking about, what the story is. But for Europe itself, because the empires abroad are largely dying, what's going to replace it is an integration at home. A decision to try and not go into a third world war that starts in Europe, and not have the Germans do this again, by in fact creating some way in which everybody is tied together. And so that one can't go to war with another country because you're too tied together. That's the idea. Controlling out Germany through economic union. Now, there was been some prior precedents of European cooperation, most notably the Congress of Vienna and the Congress system that followed it. In 1948, we actually see the Union of the Benelux countries, which is kind of a prototype, and the Benelux are Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And this is a very close economic union. There's not any economic barriers between the three. They actually had once been the same section of the Duchy of Burgundy. All three of these have been part of that. And so they're very close anyhow in terms of ideologies. Britain focused on the Commonwealth. So for any sort of integration movement to work on the continent, France had to take the lead because you can't trust West Germany yet, not in 1948. For many countries, they saw it as a way to create a new balance of power. Certainly Germany did, and certainly the Benelux countries did. Cooperation was key, but so was balance of power. And if you're going to put one of these is more important than the others, it's going to be balance of power. It's this that concept that we've been talking about all semester for the Europeans. That this is how they think about how diplomacy and how keeping the peace works is through balance of power. You wanted equality of the countries, and you wanted a nature of common security to defend against a common enemy. There are four primary authors of United Europe. Konrad Adenauer, who's the German chancellor through this, Robert Schuman, who was the French foreign minister, Dean Acheson, who was the U.S. Secretary of State in the 40s under Truman, and Jean Monnet, who was an innovator in industry, who's going to be usually known as the father of the European unity movement. And there is Schuman and Jean Monnet. The plan eventually will be Schumann's, but it will be Monnet who executes it. And the plan for economic integration begins in 1950 with Schuman. The Schuman plan is to create a coal and steel union and see if we can just get together on these two key industries. And if we can learn how to cooperate on those two, well, who knows what we can achieve after that. Well, so you have the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC, that's created in 1952. It includes France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries. So you've got 6 countries there, because Benelux is Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Now, it's very important that we see this as West Germany. So important that I stopped and put in the W, because I want you to make certain that you've got this as West Germany. West Germany is important here because this is Cold War territory. This is 1952. And we're still arguing about what's going on in Berlin in 1952. The borders have just been closed into West Berlin and into Eastern Germany. And so there's lots of problems going on there still. So in August of 52, they actually sign everything and it comes online. And this is actually going to concern the areas of the Rhineland and the Ruhr Valley, these areas that were so important in terms of coal and steel, the iron ore fields that were there, as well as the coal fields. And we're now going to integrate these two key industries in terms of equipment and standardization, so that we're all using the same kind of standard equipment. That's going to make things easier for coordination. Headquarters was in Luxembourg, which is the smallest of the bunch, and that's kind of makes it almost neutral territory. It was a supranational organization, meaning that it had the ability to actually issue orders. It was controversial at first. Lots of problems initially, lots of problems because these areas were so incompatible with one another and it had such different methods. There was a lot of destruction, there was a lot of rebuilding. And for the stuff that had survived, which was so much older and had to be retooled and brought up to speed. So there was a lot of stuff that was going on in the first years. But eventually it was started to really turn a profit. And you can see this is one of the coal trains with the flags of all the various members. And it actually did, in fact, work. The modernization was successful, and it proved successful for power sharing. And as things began to get off the ground, they also tried the European Defense Community. This was an alliance against the Cold War and to create a unified European force. But the French didn't trust the Germans enough to give up the control of their own military, with some good reason here. I mean, you fought 2 world wars against them. And being concerned about giving Germany too much military command was very, very key here. It fails, and as a result, West Germany will join the NATO alliance in 1953 to provide for West Germany's protection against the Soviet Union. In between 1954 and 1963, you see the increasing atomic programs in European countries, particularly in Britain and France. And they create Euratom, which is the European atomic community. It also doesn't really work very well for the same reasons that you see the problems with, in fact, the UDC. More successful was the economics. The economic union was always more successful than anything that required political power sharing. And in fact, many of the arguments the EU has now have to do with political power sharing more than anything else. The common market was for the Schuman Six that would eliminate tariff barriers and make ease of transportation between all of the original signatories of the ECSC. Was signed it was proposed in 1955. And the Treaty of Rome, which created it, was signed in 1957, and it went live January 1st, 1958. And there they are in Rome, signing all the treaties. This creates the European Economic Community known as the EEC. And most of the time, if you see this, they just don't bother telling you what it means. It means the European Economic Community. It means that there were no tariffs between these 6 countries: West Germany, France, Italy, and the Benelux. Okay, that's your 6. Okay, there they are: Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, West Germany, Italy, and France. Now, interestingly enough, there's less controversy about Italy than there is about West Germany and being a part of all of this. It's really fascinating to me. There was a commission, a council of ministers, parliamentary assembly, and a court of justice. So they're making it set up like it's got all of these pieces of a normal democratic government. The trade of those in the EEC grew twice the rate of non-members. There was no tariff barriers between them, and they had a common tariff barrier to any countries who were outside of that. By 1960, they were the largest trading bloc in the world. The 1960s is very much Europe literally at 6s and 7s, because those countries who were not part of the EEC formed the European Free Trade Association in 1960. You can see it here, all of those in light green and dark green. The ones in dark green are the ones who are still members of EFTA. Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland are the only ones left. Britain, Sweden, Norway, Austria, Denmark, Portugal, and Switzerland were the outer 7, and the Schuman 6 were the inner 6. And that's how they phrased it. This one was never successful because they didn't have a common tariff. They were committed more to free trade than they were to common market. Now, as I mentioned, it's only Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and I forgot Liechtenstein, which is very, very small. It's a micro country right there next to Switzerland. It doesn't even have a military. It depends on Switzerland for its military. The EEXC expands eventually in the 60s and early 70s. The British application is vetoed by de Gaulle and his government multiple times in the 1960s. They feel like the British in 1964 are going to be competitors for the French, and the French and British-German animosity rears its ugly little head again. And it'll be 1973 before Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Denmark are all admitted to the European Economic Community. And what you see up here is a lovely little GIF that shows you the growing of the EEC. With the death of Franco in Spain in 1976, we'll see Spain come in the 1980s. And basically everybody on the continent will come in except for Russia and Switzerland. The European Union was proposed in 1993, which was to be a political and economic integration. The euro came in as a common currency in 2001, and by 2007, there were 27 countries in the European Union. However, the European Union, while successfully very much economically, has not always been successful politically. And there's a lot of arguments between the small and large countries, that the small countries feel like they don't get as much of a say. And even those who have joined more recently after the fall of the Soviet Union feel like sometimes they're treated as stepchildren. Poland was not in about 2005 told to be sit down and be quiet by the French. That didn't go over well. There's still arguments over things about agricultural policy and about having charge of one's own economic policy, because you can't do as much to help your economy grow if you're beholden to economic policies set in Brussels and driven by what's going on in Germany. So there's been a lot of discussion about this, and when they tried to create an even closer union The first time they tried to do it, it didn't. They put forward a treaty, and it actually failed in both the Netherlands and in France before they had to redo the treaty. The reality is that Europe and the post-war period has a lot of issues, and economics tends to take a front row seat. Um, but that doesn't mean there aren't military matters to be considered and political diplomacy issues, because there are, though most of them will have to do with the thing that we're talking about in the next video, and that's the Cold War. And I'll see you for the very last video of the semester next time.